Hello and welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. Today we are welcomed by best-selling author of the Time Traveller's Guide series, as well as Medieval Horizons, Why the Middle Ages Matter, and 4 critically acclaimed biographies, Ian Mortimer. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society in 1998 and a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in 2015. His work on the social history of medicine won the Alexander Prize in 2004 and was published by the Royal Historical Society in 2009. And apparently, he is no relation to Roger Mortimer, the greatest traitor. Welcome, Ian.
Oh, thank you for welcoming me. Oh, we all might be in a relation to him because he did have a number of descendants by 1500. So I suspect that through his daughters, we're all descended from Roger Mortimer. But my Mortimers are not his Mortimers.
And you're not descended from the Roger Mortimer who actually stuck pins in somebody's testicles.
Oh, bloody well, hope not. That was horrible, horrible. I came across that word for needle. I didn't know the Latin word for needle. And when I translated that, I just got such a shock. And I winced.
And that little snippet of information is in Ian's new book, which is Mortimer's A to Z's of English History. A fabulous, entertaining book that covers the medieval, the Tudor, the Georgians, and the Victorians, I think it is.
No, not the Victorians. No,
not the Victorians.
There's Restoration and Regency.
Restoration, that was it. Sorry, I haven't got to that bit yet. I've been concentrating on the medieval.
Fair enough.
And it is an absolute fantastic book. So Ian's here to talk to us today. So Ian, please tell us about the A to Z of English history and how you got the idea.
Well, the best way to tell you where the idea comes from is actually where I start the book. And right back at the start of my professional career when I was working in Devon Record Office, and this would be 1991. I was on the front desk there welcoming the punters into the archives. And when there were no punters to welcome in, I would reach behind me, pick up a book from the bookshelves there. And one day I picked up Haydn's Dictionary of Dates and I was flicking through it and all the interesting dates there were there. And I came across boiling to death. And this was a statutory punishment under Henry VIII for mass poisoning. And I was horrified, especially reading about Richard Rose, who apparently poisoned 17 people, of whom 2 died. And Margaret Davy, who was a young woman who was boiled to death for poisoning somebody on the 26th of March, 1542. And I was just so shocked because although I knew Henry VIII is one of the most repulsive individuals who's ever governed this country, and there have been some contenders for that title, that one little fact said more about him and his cruelty and his wish to cause as much suffering as possible than every other detail. And in fact, you could write reams and reams and reams and not write anything as powerful as that one detail about him introducing the punishment of boiling to death and executing people that way. And then years later, when I was promoting the second Time Traveller's Guide, the Elizabethan one, I was thinking, how am I going to do this? Because the promotions for the first have been enormously taxing. I tried to pretend everybody in the audience was there in the 14th century, and I couldn't do that at every locality. I ended up having to do it, and it was very, very difficult. So I thought I need something else. And my mind went back to that poisoning punishment, the boiling to death. And I suddenly realized if you have one distinct point, which like a picture says more than 1,000 words, one distinct fact that sums up the period in some way, well, why not work with those? And I started writing down a few, and I thought, well, let's have an A to Z of them. And so I wrote all the promotions for the Time Traveller's Guides in the forms of A to Z, and they proved very successful and very popular. So recently, when I was on a stomp down the cycle path near where I live, I was thinking, why didn't I publish them? They are the one thing that I have written that's directly meant to entertain and engage people in that immediate way. I thought, well, they're wasted if I'm never going to repeat them because the books are now published and getting a bit long in the tooth. So I put them together. And of course, they had grown over the years anyway. So they're not all the same as the ones I'd actually spoken about. And having done that, of course, there was the opportunity to do a fifth A to Z of what I have learnt from writing history in the present tense for 20 years. So the last A to Z, which is the most meaningful of the whole book, is that. It is my summing up of the whole Time Travelers project.
I noticed that also has medieval speed in it, which is the subject we spoke about with you last time.
Yes.
On,
I'm very fond of it because people haven't thought in terms of what the significance of speed is. They look back on messages traveling at 20 miles a day and think, well, that's not very fast, is it? We're trundling along at 3 or 4 miles an hour, nothing to report there. But actually, the speeds at which information and people travel is crucial to understanding society and how it operates, how responsibility operates. And although it might not seem very fast to travel at 10 miles an hour rather than 4 miles an hour, that difference is huge because you're over long distances, communications and responsibility are totally changed. If you're a king at Winchester and you hear the Scots have invaded from the north, then if the message is traveling at 4 miles an hour, it's going to take a very long time to reach you and a very long time for your message to get back. But if it's traveling at 10 miles an hour or faster, then, which it could have done, and it's carried by messengers in relay, then you're going to hear about it in a matter of a couple of days maximum and be able to respond so much faster. So responsibility changes, control changes, power changes, local responsibilities change just because of a difference between 4 and 10 miles an hour.
Yeah, I mean, I think the book as a whole is really chock full of exactly those kind of developments which kind of go under the radar in normal history books.
Yeah,
they don't stress things like clocks and animals and so on.
Yeah,
and buttons.
Which are
buttons were amazing.
Yes,
the invention of buttons.
Yes.
Well, they're the nuts and bolts of life, aren't they? Really, and they're the things that I remember you mentioned glass at one point, and
yes.
You said, well, we don't notice it because we're looking through it most of the time.
Exactly.
And it's things. This is true of a lot of the things you've mentioned. We're kind of looking through them most of the time because we don't regard them as being particularly important in the age in which we live. But the development of those things in the past had a massive impact. So the book is full of those. I must admit, it is entertaining, but it's also quite thought-provoking in terms of our understanding of history.
That's the idea. If you can put those two together.
Yeah.
It's really enlightening. Yeah. It's like the one.
Oh, thank you.
The food one I was reading, and it said, "Take the standard measurement, the chicken." And it was like,
yes, absolutely.
And then and you were like, how much a chicken cost in medieval England? It was like a day's wages.
Full day's wages for a skilled worker, and that's after the Black Death when they were more affordable.
Yeah.
Even a skilled worker couldn't have afforded a chicken every day before the Black Death.
And yet it's one of the cheapest, or is the cheapest meat out there these days. It's only a fiver for a whole chicken.
Yeah, but then imagine how difficult it was getting protein in the late 13th century. Around 1280, 1290, when people were really suffering. The population had gone up to about 5 million, and trying to get any protein for a family, if you had your family holding had been subdivided down to each son having about 3 acres, as some manors in Norfolk would reduce to. You got 3 acres on which to feed a family, and that's it. You can't afford any protein. You're never going to be able to afford protein.
I think you said something along the lines at one point that without cheese, none of us would probably be here at all because it was a very important part of their diet.
Yeah, I suddenly realised this. I was must have been about 15 years ago, and I was writing on this very point about the difficulty of finding food in the late 13th century. And because people couldn't afford to buy animals, and they couldn't afford to slaughter their own, even if they had one, because they would need it for the milk or laying eggs, etc. And suddenly it occurred to me that cheese is really the savior of society over the last 4,000 years, 5,000 years. Whoever invented cheese probably did more good for mankind than anybody else ever.
Yeah. Did you find it? I mean, obviously, in any A to Z, you have some difficult letters, but did you find it hard to sort of apportion a thing to a letter, as it were? Were there things that you struggled with, or did you sort of start off by saying, well, this is a bit contrived in terms of finding letters, but I've got a certain number of things I want to include.
Yeah, I mean with the main A to Zs, the four main ones, so there's Elizabethan, medieval, Restoration, Regency. The last four letters are always the same. W is for women. X is for xenophobia. Unfortunately, that's common throughout English history.
Yeah.
Y is for your ancestors, because I want to relate this to people's actual progenitors. And Z is for the zenith of the age. So those four were set each time. And I basically used the fact they were all the same to make a comparative point. And I did for the last A to Z, I did that too. When it came to each of the historical A to Zs, I put in for one letter of the alphabet, one really key thing, a mini A to Z. So, for example, for the Restoration one, there's an A to Z of fatal diseases, which happens to be one of my specialities as a researcher and the subject of my PhD. And I therefore did have to stretch the rules a bit, perhaps. Inventive, that's the word.
Creative.
Well, I like to think I'm always inventive, but I mean, I did have to be particularly inventive with some of the letters when it came to the fatal diseases and Restoration times. And for some of the plays in Elizabethan times, not by William Shakespeare. So that was the mini A to Z there was for the plays not by Shakespeare. And I think the V for Violence had a mini A to Z to it, and and it's something to do with immorality in the Regency one. Yes, I had to be a little bit more inventive there, a bit play around with the rules. But as I said in the Elizabethan ones, this is heavily influenced by Shakespeare, even if it isn't about Shakespeare's plays. And what would Shakespeare have done? He'd have stretched the rules too. Therefore, I felt I had carte blanche. Put it that way.
Yeah, he'd have just created a new word beginning with whichever letter you didn't have a word for.
Precisely, yeah. I have a funny anecdote on that, though. And when this is about 15 years ago, I'd recently written a historical novel. I'd been invited to take part in an event at the Institute of Historical Research, and one of the panelists, not on the panel I was speaking on, but I was in the audience when Hilary Mantel was talking about the liberties taken by some historical fiction authors and screenwriters with history, and I sort of, and she said that the height of ridiculousness in historical terms is when you are eliding two characters. And I pointed out that in Henry IV, Part 1 by Shakespeare, two characters are elided in the character of the Earl of March, Edmund Mortimer. Obviously, I know more about them than most. And I said, really, if you're making a really good historical point by eliding two characters, and for the sake of a delivery of a message, the message actually is more important than the historical accuracy here, and actually showing what's going on. And this ended up in a bit of a spat between Hilary Mantel and me. And it ended with her saying very emphatically from the stage, "Yes, Ian, but you are not William Shakespeare."
Yes. Well,
so, yeah.
Who is?
I might have... she had the last word on that one.
That must have been disappointing to discover that you weren't.
Well,
yeah, I mean, it's a fairly unique one, isn't it? An A to Z of any sort of history, because there aren't that many. I was having a look to see if this had been done before, and I found an A to Z of modern British history, I think, but I didn't find many others. So it's not as if there's A to Zs of lots of things. But sometimes there's several A to Zs of things, but this seems reasonably unique.
Right. I'm glad to hear that. I haven't gone looking.
No.
I just did what I felt impelled to do. I mean, so much of my career is finding my way like a piece of convolvulus twisting between the undergrowth. I'm looking for the gap where the sun is shining, and that's the way that I tend to work. And so if somebody else has got there first, and maybe I'll notice it, but if I haven't, then I will duplicate their work, I suppose. Because I'm just finding my own way and instinctively working to where I can find meaning in understanding our place and time.
Yeah,
and that's what drives me. It's not something that's inspired by other academics or particular knotty scholarly questions. I'm driven by the quest to find meaning in understanding our place and time.
Yeah.
So you concentrate on the 14th century in the medieval section.
Yeah.
Was that because that's your most familiar? And did you were you tempted to do it in the wider centuries, or was it just there's enough in the 14th century?
Oh, 14th century. I mean, there's certainly enough. There's everything in the 14th century. I mean, everything you characterize as being medieval, it's there in the 14th century. Yes, I did the 14th century because the Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England was set exclusively in the 14th century. And I'd written biographies of Roger Mortimer, Edward III, Henry IV, for which I'd used a lot of primary material from the National Archives and British Library. And so therefore I was very, well, as familiar as most scholars are with the primary source material. And it's really important with these books, the Time Traveller's Guides, to root them in the real past, not in secondary opinions about the past, but in the actual primary source material, to go directly to the best information we have. So yes, that's why they're almost that section is heavily based on the 14th century, but there are other centuries in there because I have obviously read much more widely than just 14th century material. And there are so many sources that are instructive in showing how much was changing in the Middle Ages. And it's very instructive to particularly to compare the 12th and the 14th. Because in the 12th, you get the beginning of things like books of courtesy and books of manners and expectations of behavior. Daniel Beckel's Book of the Civilized Man, for example, is one of the earliest English behavior manuals. It says things like, don't ride into the hall on horseback and don't sleep with your godmother and things like that. Behavior for young men at court. Now, this is written at the time of the Third Crusade. I mean, it's really quite a contrast. In the 12th century, you've got, a man is not a man until he has felt his teeth crunch under the blow of an opponent's mace on his helmet. It's such a violent society, and yet it's evolving into this sort of form of courtesy, these forms of manners. And of course, 200 years later, you see 14th century is, for aristocrats, far less violent, far more refined, and these books of courtesy have taken over. And you can see there in the contrast between 12th and 14th, how much development there was and how much change, social change there was in just those 2 centuries of the Middle Ages. And normally we put 5 centuries together, if not more, as the Middle Ages. So I do draw attention to examples from other periods. And there's also the fact that sometimes you're reaching for a piece of evidence and it's just not there in the 14th, but you'll find it referenced in the 13th. Or the 15th. Rather than not provide a source in the original books, I will footnote something from an adjacent century. Now, in the A to Zs, I've avoided putting any footnotes in because they are all there in the original books, and I didn't want people paying for something twice. So therefore, all the notes and the rootedness in our documented past are there in the original Time Traveller's Guides. So every so often I do stray outside the period in order either to contrast or to root something in a documentary source.
Now, I did notice that the Black Death has an entry on its own, but then it also strays into numerous other entries as well. Was it the most significant event of 14th century or even medieval time?
Of all time for Europe. And there's nothing come close since the last ice age in terms of its impact on mankind in Europe and Asia, for that matter, the Black Death. I used to do a lecture on the Black Death, which I sort of related a couple of times, and I would frequently be told that, oh yes, it was very serious, but it was nothing like the First World War. And I thought, okay, we're going to have some perspective here. We're going to have some way of demonstrating that the First World War, despite being the most tragic events or series of events, doesn't even come close to the Black Death. And of course, then I just hit on the idea of mortality impact. So over the course of the whole 4 years of the First World War, 1.7% of the UK population was killed over the 4 years. And with the Black Death, you're looking at what's recognised to be now about in excess of roughly 45 to 55% of the population. But even if you work with 45% of the population, you're looking at that number of people dying, or that proportion of the population dying over the case of just 7 months. You're looking at a mortality impact 200 times as great as the First World War. Perhaps what I should have done was actually compare it with the Second World War, because although we think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as being almost unpardonable events for a man to order, that the destruction of so many lives. You would have had to have dropped 2 atomic bombs on 2 similar-sized Japanese cities every day for 7 months to have the same impact as the Black Death. Now, if you imagine Hiroshima and Nagasaki both taking place on the same day, and that day being repeated every day for 7 months, then you get close to the Black Death. And of course, it's not just the mortality. It's the long-term impact of that capital being, let go. I mean, so much more capital being available to such a smaller population. What it meant for people's understanding of health, people's understanding of the benevolence of God. I mean, in some ways, you can look at the Black Death and say it's still too early to judge the long-term effects of it. Too soon to tell. You can really say that about the Black Death, because if we didn't have a mortality impact like that, the late Middle Ages would have been a very, very different place.
I remember somebody saying to me, asking me, which had the most impact upon England? Was it the Black Death or the Wars of the Roses? And I said, well, that question doesn't make sense, really, because they're not in the same ballpark at all. And I think
no, nowhere near. I mean,
I don't think people understand that, really.
The 2 biggest changes, I say, Black Death and the global warming of the medieval warm period have had the biggest long-term impact. I always get sort of in 2 minds about what I put third. I'm probably going to put the French Revolution third, because that has had such a social impact across Europe and the world. But the first 2 are both medieval for me. I mean, the biggest changes that we've had since the Ice Age have been, medieval warm period and the Black Death, and I can't see anything that's close to those 2.
That's right. One of the first things you've got in the medieval A to Z, well, the first thing is animals, A for animals, and I remember when I read it being a bit surprised, and I was thinking, well, I think a lot of people are going to be surprised that animals were smaller in the Middle Ages than they are now. Why I was surprised, I'm not sure, because I used to teach the agricultural revolution, and I used to tell children that the animals got bigger. But however, it's a long time ago, so I'd sort of blanked that. But I think people will be quite surprised about that.
Well, the reason I put that in is because it was there in the original Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England, and when I was talking about animals, most people were surprised, because as I perceive their reaction, they think of animals being natural, and therefore natural being outside human control. But of course they're not. We have bred bigger and bigger animals, and we have changed the nature of animals around us, even ones we don't eat, like dogs. So though in a siege, you might well eat your dog. So it's one of those things you should expect. I decided to put it in there was because I noticed that, I think it was Daily Telegraph had picked up on the animals thing. And then there was a compendium magazine that my brother used to get called The Week, which took a bit out of newspapers, and they focused on animals as well. I thought, obviously, this is having resonance with people. So I included the A for animals in the medieval A to Z for that reason, because I was aware that people haven't got any idea how much they changed in size. They might think they got a little bit bigger. No, they trebled in size. The cows are a third of the size of a modern cow. And in terms of an average medieval cow compared to the record breakers of today, you're talking a tenth of the size. Okay, the record breakers are really big animals. You don't see them very often. But the average is 3 times bigger than a medieval animal for both cows and sheep, and slightly less for pigs. I mean, it's about 2.5 times the size for pigs. So that's a colossal difference. I mean, imagine walking home with a sheep under each arm. You couldn't imagine doing that today. Whereas you could do that, and there are medieval pictures with people walking along with a sheep under each arm. So that's a surprising thing. But then I realized that if you show somebody that there are things they haven't thought of for themselves, you are opening the gates to them realizing there are other things they haven't thought of for themselves. And you are basically creating an opportunity for you to say all sorts of things to which they will be receptive, having been shown already that they don't know it all, that their presumptions are incorrect or unfounded. So in many ways, it's a gateway. It's a gateway to a better understanding the animal's point. And so I think it's a very good thing that the word animals begins with A, and that was the first.
I mean, it's kind of like a jigsaw as well in a way, and that there's that piece animals. You put that in, that changes your perspective, and then you put clocks in, and that
Hmm.
changes your perspective again about what was important and how it was developing. So I found that it quite interesting that it was kind of random. The order, if you like,
Yeah,
it wasn't random, obviously, but it was A to Z. But you know what I mean? You weren't following an argument and
no,
saying this, then this, then this. You were putting things on the board
yeah,
and saying, "Hey, think about that. What about that? What about that?" Which I found really interesting and also kind of stimulating insofar as you just said, oh yes, I hadn't thought about that aspect of it.
yeah.
And when you factor that in, it changes what you think about that aspect of it. So yes, I found it quite a good method.
Well, I hope so. I'm glad of that because that's part of the intention. The idea is, a change is as good as a rest.
Yeah.
If you're going people
Mm.
short little details about this, that, and the other, and then suddenly you're into something totally different, then I hope no one's ever going to be bored. I mean, I hope this is the least boring book I've ever written, largely because everything is a new flash, a new understanding, a new idea, a new thing that should make you think. And also that make you think bit is essential because I'm hoping
Mm.
that people have their own imaginations triggered, so they don't just don't read through it and accept everything that they read through a couple of points, find something that's going to make them think, and pause, and then come back and read another couple of points, and perhaps pause again, and perhaps disagree with me, perhaps argue, or perhaps think the meaning of this isn't what you think it is, Ian. Whatever. I'm hoping that this whole idea of the change is as good as a rest element will add to the enjoyment, especially if you're reading or hearing me read it. I read the audiobook myself
Mm,
because these were designed to be spoken talks. They were designed to be almost a barrage of things which will keep you entertained and thinking constantly for an hour and a quarter. That's how they were
Mm.
designed. They're slightly longer than that now. They've been extended for the book, but I was at a talk the other day. I was delivering the last one, the last A to Z, of the conclusions of what it means to have written the Time Travel Slide series, and somebody said, Ian, you're the historical equivalent of Ken Dodd," and I thought, "Hey, what do you mean? What do you mean, Ken Dodd?" And he said, "Well, Ken Dodd really didn't wait for the reaction to his joke. He just fired jokes at
yeah.
you, jokes. And he said, you're the same with historical information and historical insight. Fact, insight, fact, insight, fact, fact, insight, fact.
Yeah.
And I suppose, yes, in many ways I am. I don't want to be referred to as the historical Ken Dodd, I have to say. But I understand where he's coming from in that sense of the constant flow of insight and ideas and facts.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm apologetic about that because if at some point you want to tune out and just focus on the one you've grasped, that's
Mm,
fine. My role is really to provoke thinking and provoke debate and to provoke understanding. You don't have to listen to everything I say. It's not an exercise in being comprehensive. So you've got to understand every single
mm.
word. I'm here as basically the fountain from which you'll take a glass of water.
Mm. It's very thought-provoking, actually, yeah. And I do have to say, I don't see you as the historical Ken Dodd. I hate
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
I am the
I don't really want to be
in the family law, I'm the person who told him to get off the stage. I was about 7 and he was too noisy. And I told him to go away.
Oh,
I like the Diddy Men, though. And I'm about the same height as the Diddy Men, actually. So yeah, not my favourite comedian, Ken Dodd.
no, I think he's had a favour really now. I think it was of his time.
Mm,
Yeah.
Of his time.
yeah.
So, was there anything you left out which you wish you hadn't?
Well, in many ways, the things I've included in this book, the things I'd found I'd left out of the actual time travelers guides. So it's the reverse in many ways. This is putting back in the things that I had left out of the originals. The most obvious one was the staggering fact that I only realized after I finished Time Traveler's Guide to Regency, so finished the whole sequence. When I realized that today, those in the poorest sectors of society have a life expectancy at birth of 90% of those who are the wealthiest. And that was pretty much true of the Middle Ages. It was pretty much true of the Elizabethan times. It was pretty much true in Restoration times. And in Regency times, no, it wasn't. And if you were living in an urban environment in Regency times, the poorest might expect to live 50%, not 90%, 50%, as long as their wealthiest neighbours. And in the poorest sectors, 30%, 33%. So yeah, life expectancy in Birth, in Preston, National Underline, places like that, sank down to below 14, which is the lowest recorded for anywhere, any time on Earth. That comparison, that constant of the poor expecting to live 90% as long as the wealthy, and its complete antithesis in the Regency. That was something I really missed out on in writing the Regency book, and I'm glad to be able to put it back in now into the Regency A to Z, because it's such a telling statistic for Regency times. That word Regency sounds so opulent to be associated with George IV and magnificent architecture. You know, I spend quite a lot of time in Bath, and just you walk around there and it just feels like a glorious city. And yet you realize that the people who made it all happen lived utterly miserable lives, and often very short ones. And really, you were better off being a peasant in the Middle Ages than a labourer in Regency Liverpool.
Yeah. Time of the Napoleonic Wars, the poverty, the factories before regulation, and so on and so forth. You know, it's all there, isn't it?
You name it. Yeah, you're right there. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's the one thing there aren't a lot of other things I left out, because when you're writing the Time Traveller's Guides, well, quite a lot of work and reading went into the Regency one took 4 years to do. The medieval one, I was 13 years writing it. So there was quite a lot of scope to make sure I got everything in that I wanted to.
I mean, the last section you've mentioned a couple of times, which kind of draws things together, but also takes them a lot further, because that's probably the most thought-provoking section, where you're really inviting the reader to take the baton up, really, and say, well, okay, this is what I've said to you. Where are you going with that? What do you think about that? I mean, it occurred to me that this book really ought to be read by anybody studying history at school before they start on anything else, so that they've got a grounding of things they might want to look out for. Not to remember everything, but just, pointers that some will take one thing, some will take something else, but that it gives a really good understanding of key issues. And I was really impressed by the last section, and I was thinking about little things like you said, well, the fact that we know that a house had these books in it doesn't mean that the people read them. Thinking, well, yeah, that's so obvious, really. I mean, in our houses, it's the same, isn't it? You know, we may have
certainly in
books.
this one.
I've got loads of books I haven't read.
Right.
Yet, a historian might say, oh, well, they had this book, so they knew about so-and-so. Whereas, in fact, they probably didn't.
I mean, yes, you're quite right. I mean, I've really tried to make every one of the last 26 a springboard for somebody to do something else with. Or I think I said in the book, I've said it somewhere else if I haven't written in the book, every one of those last 26, or the last A to Z, was the title of a book, another book I could have written.
Yeah, you did say that, I think.
Things like, I did say that. Okay. I mean, things like C for the class system. I mean, we hear a lot about the class system, and it is always at the most superficial level. Why does a class system exist? Well, think about how it operates and how society functions with a class system, and you get a more nuanced understanding of how a class system exists and why, therefore, they continue to exist. But if you read anything about a class system by people who write about the newspapers, and I quote a couple of examples, you find it's an objection to one part of it. It's almost like a class war in itself. No one ever seems to talk about it with any understanding. So just one little letter, C for class system. I put forward an idea of why the class system exists. Feel free to disagree with it, but do engage. Don't just take it for granted, because we have all these social structures that have come into being and look like remaining. Why is that? They're not forced on us by some sort of act that says the class system will be this way or anything else, So every one of those last point should be a springboard for people to do their own thinking. And especially, and more than any other letter in the whole book, the Z of the final A to Z. Because when it came to writing down what is the zenith of the last 1,000 years, that is a really, really big question. And you can't just sort of put in a glib answer. You can't say an answer is going to be the answer. You've really got to go out and look for what is deeply meaningful to a lot of people, which represents something which is an apogee, a zenith, but at the same time isn't just something that's been acquired at other people's cost. So that was all the last A to Zs were not researched. They were researched by going out for a long walk. And the longest walk was the Z, the zenith of the last hour.
Yeah, it's certainly a very interesting section, and so many things there. Too many for us to mention all today, but I mean, certainly if people look at it, I think they'll be surprised how much breadth there is in it.
Yeah.
Which I was really impressed with, I must admit.
Well, I've devoted my life really to understanding English history, and especially the last 700 years. Not so much the last 100, but most of the last 700 years. And I live in a historic house. My current book, which I'm just editing at the moment, is a history of England seen from the point of view of the people who lived in this house from the Saxon period. So, or on the site of this house. So, from the Saxon period, a single viewpoint of the whole country. So, I do have this sort of being soaked in English history approach to things. This isn't something I choose to do. This is the way I live my life. I'm surrounded by historical things, always have been, historical environments. And I see it as a vocation to not only to understand it myself, but make it meaningful to other people. So we do understand our place in time, and we do have a way of looking to the future with optimism, because yes, on past experience, the future has terrible things to offer us, but also on past experience, we will overcome every adversity we need to.
And you were saying before we actually started recording that we in history nowadays we need closure with everything, don't we? We need answers for why everything happened in a certain way. And you're not always going to get that. So you have to be a bit more accepting that history is just history.
Yeah.
And that you can't do short-term and long-term causes for absolutely everything.
No. And I just mentioned my forthcoming book, Through the Windows of an Ordinary House, History of England. I mean, there you're looking not only at what happens inside the house, looking in through the windows, but looking at their perspective on national history developing and then international developments from looking out through the windows. So you're trying to combine domestic, local, political, cultural, and economic and social history all in one volume. Now, when you're forced to break down the barriers like that, that really makes you realize how we teach snippets. We really haven't got a coherent and cohesive, integrated understanding of how people in the past lived. And you'd have thought with 3,500, 4,000 professional historians in this country and loads of people who are in the heritage industry, that we should have worked towards that by now. We've been doing English history for the best part of 1,500 years, since Gildas, and yet we still haven't really worked our way towards having integrated understandings of our place and time. So that is my vocation. And at the moment, in my 50s, it's very much focusing on the perspective. What is our perspective on the past? How do we understand things, not only because of the information that comes to us, but how does our perspective alter our understanding? And how can we get different understandings and broader understandings from looking at things with a different perspective? So, yeah, that's what I'm doing now.
And I think that's the thing where I blame the Victorians for a lot of the history, but that's their perspective on history, which is history itself.
Absolutely, they needed to look at things through a moral framework. I mentioned the stained glass monocle, sort of looking down through St. Peter judging us all on this green triangle of England. I mean, they needed that moral framework towards their judgments. Well, we don't need that moral framework. If we need a moral framework, it's a different one, which is probably much more fragmented. But we don't necessarily need a moral framework. We, in many cases, just need to understand why what happened and what is its significance for the people affected at the time and people who've come after and people who have yet to come after us. So there are lots of different perspectives and lots of different ways of looking at the past. And I do have a problem with the fact that people are educated to believe that their education is the limits of history. We need a historical education system, and it does need to fit people for other purposes other than just doing the past. They do need to analyze data and produce conclusions, etc. History remains a valid educational process for that purpose. But we also should be teaching people that history is much more than just those things. It really is a multidimensional, all-encompassing view of everything that ever happened to everybody in the world, and you can look at it in all sorts of ways and derive meaning from it in an infinite number of ways. So I really feel we should be pushing that as well.
Yeah, I mean, history has become almost a narrow discipline. And the one thing it isn't really is narrow.
Yeah.
It's life. So that's about as broad as you can get, really.
Absolutely. Yes.
It's
as we were talking about earlier, no, people don't walk around with the date of death after their names in brackets. No.
Yeah, and what they were at the end of their lives is not necessarily the person they were when they were 16 and looking forward to the future.
They started. No.
Hopefully not. No.
Yeah. In fact, they could say that for almost everybody. And I remember thinking that very thing when I was writing The Perfect King, my second biography about Edward III. And I was contrasting what he became at the end of his life when he was feeble and looking back on past glories with that optimistic, dynamic leader he was in 1330 to 1336. So youthful, so optimistic, wanting to create this chivalric kingship. And at the time, I was a member of Dartmoor National Park Authority, Secretary of State appointee to Dartmoor National Park Authority. And I was sitting there thinking, looking at a certain person in the room, thinking, you must have been dynamic and ambitious once upon a time, and now you've become that person like old Edward III, just looking back on past glories. And you can learn from this and make comparisons, but also you can see somebody today and think, that makes me understand that transition in that person as well. You go from the optimistic, bushy-tailed, bright-eyed young thing who's going to take the war to France to the old man who has to be swaddled in bands and nailed into his throne to stay upright.
And he gets accused of having lived too long and things like that.
Yes, even though he only got to 64.
He was an old man. He should have died 10 years ago, and then he would have just carried on being the glorious king he was. But because he got old,
that's right. Whatever the third case, he gets accused of having too many sons. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Because 100 years later there'll be a civil war. Oh,
yeah, and
maybe you didn't see that
and you've
coming.
got Henry the First, who's accused of having not enough sons. Well, not enough legitimate ones, anyway.
Yeah.
Yes. History by hindsight is a wonderful thing.
Oh yes, well that's the way it's written, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, if you read it in advance, it would be well.
I think that's the thing. It's the difficulty people have in writing the history when they know how it ends. So they're writing everything with a view to the ending, whereas the people who were actually living it had no idea. Like you say, nobody knew that Henry IV was going to die in 1413. Nobody knew that he was going to usurp Richard II in 1399 until he decided he was going to do it.
But I mean, on that very note, I mean, the example I always use is in relation to what-if history, because what-if history, amongst academics especially, has got a bad name because these things didn't happen. So therefore, what's the point in studying them? Well, I say, think about Drake and the Armada at that moment. Nobody knew that Drake was going to be able to defeat the Armada. It was a huge army. It was on much bigger ships. We had bonfires up and down the south coast preparing for invasion. What if the Spanish Armada had landed was a question on many, many people's minds. If you were a Lord Lieutenant or a Deputy Lieutenant or a Sheriff of a county in the Elizabethan period in 1588, you'd have been very minded. What's going to happen what if they land? So that what if question takes you directly to the indecision in people's minds. And they would have thought through, what if they land here? What if they land there? We will have to have beacons. We will have to muster men from it. We'll have to bring in the trained bands of militia. They would have thought through that. So what if questions actually do have meaning in taking you to the actual moment in the past and saying, imagine the Armada wasn't synonymous with a fantastic English victory.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a critical moment as far as people of the time were concerned. It was that they were facing annihilation, really, in a sense, or the possibility of it.
They were facing the challenge of Protestantism versus Catholicism. And I often think of the defeat of the Armada as being the last great medieval battle, because it was seen as a struggle in which God played a role. And the wind dispersing the ships, the fire ships, and the Armada being dispersed, it was very much God came down on the side of the Protestants. And medieval battles always have this religious dimension to them, whereas modern ones we see in a much more secular light. So yes, I mean, it was a titanic struggle because so much more was at stake.
Yeah, you've told us what you're working on now. When are we expecting that work to be completed? How far are you on with that?
Well, it was completed 5 months ago, but I've been editing it for 5 months, and my 2-year-old editor, who has really gone far beyond the call of duty on this. It's been a really difficult book to edit because you're trying to fuse too many things, and it's turning out to be a fantastic book, and I'm very proud of it. But large chunks need rewriting, and large chunks need cutting out a lot of the detail, which is interesting at a local level, but not on a national. So it's been really tricky. I've also been working on a book about the principles of history. How do we know what we think we know? So it's literally 80 principles which govern how you should write history. These are the rules that no one's actually written down. So how evidence needs to be deconstructed to find the information within it, and how you use information to construct facts, how you, through the assemblage of facts, can show the limits of the reinterpretation of the past, thereby providing an antidote to the postmodernist questioning of history. So that's a big thing that's occupied me for the last 3 years. I'm also returning to the Edward II's death question, because I can now prove that there is no basis for saying he died in Berkeley Castle. So that's another big thing on my radar. And for the last 4.5 years, my wife and I have had a project whereby we've looked at every single supposedly medieval pub in the country. We have visited 953 of them.
That must have been such a bind, having to drink in 953 pubs.
Well, it's not easy, I've got to tell you that. I mean, one day we were in Hertfordshire, we saw 19 pubs in one day and had a drink in 15 of them.
Wow.
But that sounds very easy and glib, but that also means I had to photograph every historical element of every single building. So I'm constantly running around, darting around like a fly, sort of taking photos, trying to find out what people say about the pub, why they believe it's old, what it means to them that it's old. So it's been an anthropological study as much as a historical one. But yeah, so that study about medieval pubs will we're going to finish writing it up. We've seen all the pubs now, and I'm probably going to finish writing that about March time-ish, February, March. So that's that's the next thing to bring to fruition after through the windows of an ordinary house. But in many ways, that's taking something everybody's familiar with and showing how you get loads of stories told about build for the people who built the church and things like that. It's always rubbish. People just don't look into the real history. And because they're pubs and they're slightly immoral, therefore traditional historians haven't spent that much time looking into the matter in real detail. And although there are quite a few books on pub signs, none of them have taken a comprehensive view and looked at the earliest instances in every place of where pub signs start to be used. So this book it's a history of pub signs, it's a history of pub buildings and the development of the purpose built in. We found quite a few that have never been noticed by historians before. And also, what is a pub? Why do people want their pub to be old? So that's a book that needs to be slimmed down somewhat, because it's very, very large at the moment. But it will one day, I hope, show people that even through a pub, you can have a different perspective on the past.
Well, I look forward to that one.
It's the one book everybody asks me, how's the pub book going?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think most of them are seeing it as a tourist guide to pubs, though.
Well, the thing is, not all the usual claimants, the Fighting Cocks and St Albans, the Old Trip to Jerusalem and Nottingham, all of them are grossly exaggerating their age, and therefore concealing the genuinely old pubs, which have been going since the Middle Ages, because there are about 200 genuine, substantially medieval buildings, and about 40 to 50 of them have been going constantly since the 15th century, and sometimes they've been rebuilt. But sometimes they're in their intact buildings, like the Crown in Shipton under Wychwood or the George in Norton St Philip. Actually, the Crown in Shipton under Wychwood wasn't built as a pub, but the George was. And you do find here and there purpose-built pubs that have kept on going since the 14th or 15th centuries. I want to champion the genuine ones because we really should be celebrating English pub culture. It's one of our greatest cultural contributions, certainly to the UK. Yeah, the English pub, which is a fusion of the old inn, the alehouse, and to a lesser extent, the tavern. It was recognised as an institution in itself by the 17th century when people start using the term the public house.
You must be very busy.
I spend all my time working, that I'm not doing something more interesting.
Well, thank you very much, Ian Mortimer, for joining us today. I highly recommend everybody gets a hold of the A to Z, Mortimer's A to Zs of English history, because it is a fascinating read. Whether you know loads about history or just a little bit, it's a great book just to... because there are also, each section is only about 2 pages long. So if you've only got 5 minutes before you have to go and do something, you can have a read, which I really like the idea of. Or if you've got an hour on a train, you've got plenty of time to have a read. So it's perfect for everybody.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, yes, it's been a pleasure talking to you. So thank you.
It's always our pleasure, Ian. Oh, and I do highly recommend everybody goes back and has a listen to our last episode with Ian Mortimer, entitled Medieval Speed, because that was truly enlightening as well. I always learn so much when you join us, Ian.
Well, very kind. Thank you very much.
No.
I will try and keep the standard up for whenever it happens again.
Thank you. And we look forward to having you back to talking about probably the public houses at some point.
All right, okay, well, I'll definitely do that one. That's going to be good fun. Thank you.
Do join us next time when Derek and I will be investigating post-Roman Britain. And that's going to be our first episode of 2026. So it's just left to me to wish you all a very happy new year, and we'll see you next year. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed our podcast during the last year. This one will go out on New Year's Eve, so I wish you a happy new year as well.